Hello everyone and welcome to this introduction to building a strong business case. I'm David Fairhurst, Executive Chair at Mutual Ventures, and I've over 25 years experience in the professional services industry, a chunk of that spent in corporate finance and investment appraisal, and certainly over the last 18 years or so, business case development has been a recurring feature of the work that I've been involved with. I'm joined today by Alyssa Davis.
Hi everyone, I'm Alyssa Davis. I'm a senior consultant at Mutual Ventures and I've got about 10 years experience of working in the public and voluntary sector, and I've done various business cases for big and small projects along the way.
Our aim for this session is to introduce you to the basics of building a robust business case, and we'll also signpost you to other reference materials and support that you can access. So let's dive right in and explain what a business case is and what its purpose is. What is a business case? Simply, a business case is a tool to help make decisions about a proposed course of action, for example, investing in a new service or changing the way existing services are provided, often with the aim of reducing costs and improving the customer experience. Business cases can be long or short, but the level of detail should be proportionate to the magnitude of risks associated with the investment decision you're considering. What's the purpose of a business case? Well, the primary purpose of a business case is to help decision makers assess the benefits and costs of an undertaking and understand any issues or risks based on the available evidence so that they can make a sound and fully informed decision. A good business case will explain the current as-is situation, why change is needed, and the end position to be achieved. The business case will examine several credible options for achieving that end, often including a do-nothing and a do-minimum scenario for comparison. It will include a robust and objective assessment of those options, which will include a consideration of comparative costs, benefits, resources, affordability, payback, and other critical success factors. Crucially, a good business case also provides a basis for managing, monitoring, and evaluating the success of the investment during and after implementation. There are many different approaches you can take to developing a business case. The approach you take needs to be proportionate to the project. To decide on the best approach, you need to think about the value of the investment you're making. The higher the spend, the more detail you'll need to go into. The scale and level of complexity of the project, for example, the number of services and organisations involved, whether it's something that has been done before or if it's a novel and tested concept. The type of business case you are making. Is it a compliance-based case, something you must do? Is it about business enhancement, i.e. increasing revenue or reducing costs? Or is it about asset replacement? There may be other investment categories pertinent to your particular sector or line of work. The same principles of good business case development apply, whatever the nature of the case, but the criteria you may use to select the optimal way forward could vary. The potential impact on service users. The greater the impact, the more detail you'll need to go into. And finally, think about who is making the decision and who influences them, what level of information they need, and what are the issues they're most concerned with. I'm going to take you through the overall process from start to finish, and then two different approaches that our clients have found helpful in developing business cases. First, the desirability, feasibility, viability approach, and then the 5-case model, which is the recommended approach by HM Treasury. So first, a quick overview of the process that typically people go through when developing a business case. First, do you have a clear vision? Set your vision and goals for the proposal. What are you trying to achieve? What problem are you trying to solve, and for whom? Figure out what good would look like in discussion with your key stakeholders. What is the case for change? This should be local and specific, but also reflect national agendas and trends. Work with your stakeholders to develop a set of criteria to narrow down the options and agree how they will be applied. Develop a long list of possible options. Apply those criteria objectively to identify a short list of options and the reasons why other options are not being considered in more detail. Then develop a business case, a detailed business case with a recommended option. An approach to business case development that we have used successfully for many years is based around testing the relative desirability, feasibility, and viability of potential alternative options. Using this framework, you establish criteria and test each option against its desirability. So how desirable is the option for users and stakeholders? Is it something they want? What do they need from that particular service? This is part of the business case where you can develop that in full and test options against criteria set specifically against desirability. Feasibility is the proposed solution feasible, and we often think about this in terms of feasible for people involved, be they staff, users, other stakeholders, partners, for example. Is it feasible from a process perspective? Is it technically doable? So from a technology point of view, can this particular solution be achieved? And finally, and very importantly, viability. What are the costs and benefits of the various options that you have for taking forward your solution, your proposal, and consider the affordability of each of those options. This approach can be applied iteratively, so you might start with a fairly high-level assessment of a long list of options and narrow it down to a short list, and then retest those options again against the criteria, but this time in a greater degree of detail, depth, and rigor. You'll often find that some options on the long list will fall out very quickly when tested against the criteria, and therefore don't require the in-depth analysis that you do on the second iteration. You can't have a meaningful discussion about business cases in the public sector without referencing HM Treasury's Green Book and its 5-case approach to business case development. The 5-case model is a respected and trusted approach recommended by Treasury. It can be used for projects or programs, and there is specific detailed guidance for both. You might want to use this model either to ensure you are taking a robust approach or to be sure of meeting the criteria for accessing funding from central government for a specific project. The 5-case model is a helpful way of ensuring you give enough consideration to all the key issues and ensure a rounded appraisal. The 5-case model is a helpful way of ensuring you give enough consideration to all the key issues. Firstly, the strategic case. The strategic case is where you describe the change that's required. What is the need for change? What is the burning fire under your chair that's created the requirement for some change to happen? And in the strategic case, this is where you'll outline the strategic objectives that you're looking to achieve. And ideally, that would align to a government policy or a departmental requirement or your own local government's strategy plan. The next case is the economic case, and this is often seen as the engine room of the 5-case model. This is the sort of cost-benefit area of the case, and this is where you look at the costs and the benefits of each of the options against a stay as we are and a do minimum comparison case. Next, we have the commercial case. In the commercial case, this is often where you explore things such as the commercial viability of the options that you're looking at. Ideally, dropping out of the economic case, you'll have only a small number of options to take forward. The preferred option, the next best option, and maybe one other for comparison too. In the commercial case, you'll look at those in a bit more detail, and you'll examine things such as the procurement route that you might take to find a supplier. You might look at the market analysis to understand whether or not there is a vibrant array of suppliers able to meet the requirements of the case, should a supplier be required. You might look at the contractual aspects of the case and what sort of nature of contract is required for each of the approaches that you have narrowed the options down to. Then we have the financial case. In a financial case, we look at the affordability of the case. So not the costs and benefits specifically, but whether or not and how that might be financed, either funded by central government funds or local funds if it's a local government case or an NHS case, for example. And this is also where we set out the various risks associated with the case, and you might include some scenario analysis based around some of the key assumptions in the economic case. Finally, then, we have the management case. And in the management case, this is where we set out our plans for how each of the options we're looking to take forward could be delivered, how those risks would be managed, and how ultimately we'd exit from the programme. A 5-case model approach can be taken using a 1-, 2-, or 3-stage process, depending on the size and complexity of the proposal. A single-stage business case could be used for low-value, low-risk projects, but Treasury recommend a 3-stage business case, certainly for any high-value project, so over 2 million is the guidance they provide, or if it's a high-risk, complex programme. The three various stages for consideration of a strategic outline case. This is focused on the case for change. In the strategic context, it provides an understanding of the critical success factors, the long list of possible options, preferred way forward, and a recommended shortlist of 3 to 4 options, including the business as usual, do minimum cases. And it also provides an overview of the financial and commercial and management cases, but at this stage in fairly light detail. The next stage is the outline business case. This focuses on identifying the preferred option and will include an analysis of the shortlisted options against the 5 cases in quite a high level of detail. The final step is the full business case. This often focuses on the preferred option and the next best option, as the level of analysis and evaluation is quite detailed. This case confirms the level of financial and non-financial benefits that the preferred option will realise and demonstrates that the preferred option will be commercially viable, affordable, and sets out the commercial and contractual arrangements and clearly outlines the management arrangements to ensure the preferred approach can be delivered successfully. Now, here's Alyssa to take us through each of the cases in further detail.
Thanks, David. So we're going to start off with the strategic case. This is arguably the case that you're going to want to spend the most time and thought considering and where you're going to want to put the most engagement with your stakeholders. So there's 2 main questions the strategic case should answer. Firstly, what is the case for change? Why is the change necessary? And secondly, why is the option you've selected the best option? What strategic objectives are you trying to achieve? So you'll want to start off by giving an overview of the strategic context of your proposal. For example, what are the current and future challenges your organisation is facing? This should be specific to your local organisation, but you should also pick up national policy agendas and think about kind of how what you're proposing connects to the context in which you're sitting. The next element is the project scope and the key features. So you want to give an overview of exactly what it is that you're proposing. It's helpful if you can to kind of provide all the details on one page or in one place. So for example, a simple diagram or a visual showing what it is that you're proposing and how it will work. It can also be quite useful to look at what's in and out of scope for the project or programme and how this is different to business as usual. So what's going to change and what will it look like? The next bit that's really important is to think about what you're trying to achieve. So what are the overall aims and objectives of a proposed intervention? It's useful to be as smart here as possible. It's also important to include some specific outcome measures and be clear on how you'll know if the proposal has succeeded. It's really important here, as with the other bits of this case, to consider how the objectives align with the strategic priorities of decision makers and all the organisations that are involved if you're doing something that involves multiple organisations. It can be quite helpful to think widely about social impact and identify the specific groups affected by the proposal and the costs and benefits for each of these groups. The next element is around the risks and constraints. So really important here to think through what are the potential risks of what you're doing? Are those risks manageable? And if so, how can they be managed? And you'll need to engage with stakeholders to think about the overall appetite for risk within the organisation and whether the risks you identified are acceptable when weighed against the benefits of the proposal. It's also really important to think about the constraints and dependencies. So what's going to get in the way or stop you being successful in implementing the option? It's also really important to think about the other options that you've considered and why the option you've selected is going to be the best option for you. Next, we're going to look at the economic case. The key question here that you want to answer is whether the proposed option represents good public value for money. The economic case should be where you identify a preferred delivery model option from a financial viability and sustainability perspective and allow you to demonstrate that you are making best use of public funds. There's 3 main sections to this. So the first is the expected benefits. So what are the key benefits of the proposal? It's really important here to focus on financial benefits and things that you can quantify, but also on the wider benefits too, which might be less easy to quantify, but equally important in terms of understanding why you're proposing that this is the best option. Secondly, to think about the disbenefits. So what are the costs and risks of the proposal and how do these compare to the benefits that you're expecting to see? And then thirdly, to conduct an assessment of the net benefit of the proposal. So the comparison between the benefits and the risks and cost of the proposal to reach a conclusion on the overall value for money of what you're proposing. It's really important when you do this that you're prudent and that you have a detailed model, particularly for the financial benefits. So always overestimate the costs and risks and underestimate the potential benefits to guard against any kind of optimism bias that you might have. It's also really important to think about the assumptions that you're making in terms of the benefits, costs and risks, and to test these. Lastly, it's quite easy to focus really narrowly on the things that you can measure, but it's really important that you think widely and look at the impact on the whole system, as well as the impact on your individual organisation. And depending on the proposal you're making, you may want to look at cost avoidance, as well as cashable savings and the direct cost benefit ratio. Treasury guidance has recently been updated and is also clear that projects should consider social and environmental impacts, including less quantifiable costs and benefits, even if that's not the primary objective of what you're doing. Next, we're going to look at the commercial case. As David said, this focuses on whether the proposal is commercially viable. For example, how will it be procured? And is there a market out there for what you're trying to do, particularly if you're doing something where you're maybe looking at bringing in a partner or outsourcing a service or setting up a new organisation. So this is where it starts to get quite technical. And there are a number of technical elements that you'll want to consider in order to really understand the risks and liabilities associated with what you're doing and how it's going to sit in the market. So I mentioned procurement already. It's really important to think about whether this is something you are going to procure, and if you are, what is the planned route for doing that and what the risks are for doing that. This is an area where it can be really helpful to have either internal or external legal advice. And in our experience, having clarity on this issue early is a really key success factor for a lot of projects, because if you can't procure it safely and legally, it's not going to happen. The next element of this is around the staffing arrangements. So what impact is your proposal going to have on the staffing? Are you going to need new staff? Will you need to move around existing staff or transfer them, for example, to a partner or a different organisation? These can be quite complex and quite costly, particularly in the public sector. So it's worth thinking early about things like pensions, TUPE regulations if you're transferring staff, and any things like redundancy liabilities or other liabilities associated with moving staff. And it can be really important to get specialist HR input here to make sure you fully understand the implications of what you're doing, and then that's all been thought through. The next element is around the support infrastructure. So this kind of has two elements to it. So firstly, what support infrastructure will you need in order to implement the proposal? So what input will you require from teams like finance, IT, HR? But also depending on what you're doing, if, for example, you're proposing to set up a new organisation or a partnership, that may require its own new support infrastructure. So really thinking through what it is that you're going to need in place for that option to succeed. Similarly, with assets and systems, you want to think through what it is that you're going to need in place for this to work. So for example, you might find that you need to do some additional data sharing and that you need agreements and systems in place to do that. Equally, it might be that you're opening new premises or you're moving to different locations and you need to secure property or consolidate property, and similarly with technology. So it's really worth just thinking that all through, and make sure you've engaged with the relevant teams across your organisation in order to do that. Also, if it is something you're procuring, it's really important to think about the exit strategy if it all goes wrong and the option is no longer commercially viable. One other thing it's really important to think about here is the ownership and governance arrangements, particularly if you're setting up something new that goes outside of your existing ownership and governance. So next, we're going to look at the financial case. The key question for the financial case is whether the proposal is affordable over time and the financial risks and costs it will create. So the main building block of the financial case is often a 5-year financial model, which helps you to understand and compare the one-off and lifetime costs of each of the shortlisted options and the final option that you're selecting in order to compare financial performance and sustainability. And this is what we mean by an investment overview. So understanding kind of across the lifetime, what is it that it's going to cost and how and why have you accounted for that? So you'll want to look at things like the overall level of funding required, how affordable it is, and the ongoing and one-off costs. Sensitivity analysis is really crucial here because the financial model is only as good as the assumptions that you put into it. So it's really important to understand and be clear about the assumptions that you're making and why, and what will happen if that changes over time. So essentially you want to know that the financials still stack up, even in a bad or worst case scenario, in order to understand the level of risk that you might be taking if the finances don't turn out as you expected them to be. So often what people do is to pick a range of different scenarios to test. So for example, if the level of income is lower than we expect it to be, or the costs are higher than we expect them to be, in order to make sure you're being really prudent and robust. It's also really important to think through, once you know how much the proposal will cost, how you will be funding it. So where is the money going to come from to fund it? What criteria might it need to meet in order to be acceptable to decision makers who hold those finances? And what will the impact be, both on your own on the specific service or thing that you're looking at, but also on the wider organisation as a whole? So who is funding it? What budget is it coming from, in order to really understand the kind of overall impact and the overall affordability for your organisation or for the organisations involved in delivering it. Next, we're going to look at the last case, which is the management case. And this is really all about whether what you're proposing can actually be implemented and the risks involved in delivering it. So one element of this is the approach to implementation. For example, what is it that you're going to need to do in order to implement what you're proposing? What are the key work streams that you're going to be looking at? So that might be things like IT, people, a range of different things depending on what you're actually doing. And then to think through the resources that you're going to need in order to deliver that plan, to get it up and running, but also to keep doing whatever you're proposing on a long-term basis. So those could be internal resources, and they could also be external resources. And these need to be completely understood and fully costed up and included in your 5-year financial model. And it's really important that as a whole, anything that you're suggesting you require in the management case has been fully factored into the financial case, so that you get that join up between the cases. So the next thing you'll also need to think about are the risks to delivering the proposal and the mitigating actions. And these should be both to kind of the proposal as a whole, but also to the organisation more widely as well. And then this seems relatively obvious, but at this point, even before you've started delivering the proposed action, it's really important that you have a detailed programme and project plan setting out all of the key actions that you're expecting to need to take. And as I said, that those are costed up properly. And then finally, you will want to think about the controls that you'll need in place. So these could be things like tolerances on the level of risk and what needs to happen when a risk amount has been exceeded. Or it could be things, particularly in the public sector, like where democratic oversight sits. And lastly, an exit strategy. So if the project plan, for whatever reason, proves to not be deliverable, how would you stop the project? And what would the impact of that be? So next, we're going to talk a bit about the skills that are needed to develop a successful business case. So this is really all about striking the right balance between taking people with you and developing a robust and coherent document. So on the stakeholder engagement side, you need to be really clear about the context of the business change you're proposing and who is critical to it happening or not happening. For example, are you making the change in order to comply with new legislation or regulation? Or is it a project to enhance the business, so to cut costs or to drive down costs? It's really important to map your stakeholders internally and externally so that you understand who you need to build relationships with and their views on the risks and benefits. Those might look quite different depending on where people are in the organisation. And your job really is to create a coherent set of arguments that address all of their concerns with the right level of evidence in the right level of detail. So it's really important to consider the key questions your stakeholders are going to need answering so that you can provide those answers in order to get them to back the proposal. So think about who in the organisation already has a strong relationship with each stakeholder and has that understanding of what their goals are and how you can tap into that. It's really important to think about where the politics lies in all of this, particularly in public sector organisations. So what is it that's likely to be contentious about your proposal? What are people likely to have concerns about? And to consult on that as widely as possible to make sure your document is robust and can address those risks and concerns. And some of these can be real and some of them can be perceived. So it's also really important to take both of those seriously and to think it through. So that's what we mean by managing the politics. The other side of this really is developing a really robust, pragmatic and technically correct document. So making sure you understand the context of the change, bringing in all of the relevant bits of input that you need from across the organisation. So this might lie within your specific service or specific part of the organisation that you're in, but you may also need to bring in input from other teams, for example, finance, HR, IT, performance, legal. There's lots of different people you might want to bring in depending on what you're doing, and that should be quite proportionate to the size and shape of what you're doing. The other bit that's really crucial is the analysis and financial modelling. So both in terms of looking at financial costs and savings, and also in terms of thinking through the longer term impact on outcomes. It's really important, as I said before, to have that narrative that's running kind of cleanly throughout your business case that allows you to connect up all the different bits and to do that persuasively. So you may need to bring in some external technical expertise in order to address some of those issues and get them right. And now I'm going to hand back to David, who's going to take us through some do's and don'ts.
Right, thanks, Alyssa. We're now going to consider some do's and don'ts from our experience of developing public service business cases using the approaches that we've just run through. So some of the key do's, really important to engage, as Alyssa's referred to there, to engage with key stakeholders involved in both involved in delivering and in deciding on the merits of the case. It's important to identify who they are, both stakeholders and key influencers, so that they understand the critical success factors, plus any dependencies, issues and risks that are relevant to them that your business case should consider. Use your strategic objectives as the golden thread. Ensure there is a clear line of sight from government policy through to departmental or local plans and priorities, and this will enable you to articulate the relevance and importance of your project in support of wider decisions and wider decision maker goals. I mentioned dependencies earlier, and just to emphasise that at an organisational level, this is important, as you may need sign-off from other departmental heads that your proposal doesn't, and ensure that your proposal doesn't create issues for them. For example, is it in line with IT strategy, people, and organisational development priorities, and so on. We're focusing purely on the public sector here, and considering the wider impact of your investment on other parts of the public sector is an important consideration. So does your proposal impact or have dependencies elsewhere, positively or negatively? It's really important to articulate those and explore those in your business case. Some of the key don'ts. Whilst the final output of the business case process is a documented record of the analysis undertaken to reach that recommended preferred solution, the quality of the options appraisal and the rigour and robustness of that work is the critical aspect here. If you apply Pareto's 80-20 rule, then you're probably on the right track in terms of how effort should be split. The cost-benefit analysis, i.e. the economic case in the 5-case approach, is often regarded as the engine room of the business case as we've explored, but that doesn't mean the other cases are less meaningful or important. You can have the most attractive cost-benefit outcome, but if the solution cannot be implemented effectively or if it carries too much commercial risk, then it's worthless. So ensure you thoroughly consider all aspects of your case. There's often a tendency with those pushing a particular idea or proposal to become rather partial to it, and they can overestimate the benefits and underestimate the costs. And this is quite a common characteristic. So watch out for this optimism bias, and if you can, ensure you build in some independent challenge to your approach. It's useful to include some sensitivity analysis too, as we've examined, to quantify the potential implications if you have over or underestimated any of your expected benefits or costs. It's been part of the Green Book approach for years, but following a recent review, HM Treasury have now embedded equality and environmental impact assessments as a core part of the Green Book. So ensure you read their more detailed guidance and make due consideration in your case. These are just a few do's and don'ts, just to whet your appetite, but there are many more built up from years of experience, and you can take a look at some of the other materials signposted on our website for further guidance. So we hope you found this introductory session useful. We're very happy to discuss business case development or any of the issues raised in this recording in more detail with you. Just drop us an email or give us a call. You'll find some links below on our website to helpful documents or approaches to developing your business case. Thanks very much from Melissa and I for joining us this afternoon, and good luck with your business case.